Did you hear the story about the man who couldn't stand seeing his own brother succeed and decided to solve the problem in the worst possible way? I know. Some people turn other people's happiness into a personal problem. And that is exactly what happened here. The two of them were brothers. They grew up in the same house, same parents, same upbringing. Eventually, each one went down a different path. One worked with flocks, the other lived from what he planted. A normal life. At least it seemed that way. Until one day, both of them decided to present the results of their work. It was a gesture of gratitude. Each one brought what he had produced. But then something happened that nobody expected. One brother's work was received very well, the other's was not. And that should have been the end of it. Anyone would have been upset. That happens. Not. Everything works out all the time, but he could not let it go. And the strangest part is that his anger did not stay with the one who had rejected his work. It landed on his brother, who, as far as we know, had done absolutely nothing. The only problem was that things had gone right for one of them and not for the other. You can almost imagine the atmosphere inside that house after that. That silence, the conversations getting shorter and shorter, the comparison happening all the time, even if no one said a word. And the more he thought about it, the bigger it seemed to grow, until one day he invited his brother to go out with him. No argument, no fight, just an invitation. The two of them went out to a remote place, alone. And it was there that everything changed, because that invitation was never meant for a conversation. Funny thing, if I had told you this story using their names from the beginning, you might have paid less attention, because a lot of people think they already know this story, but almost nobody remembers it this way. It did not happen on a modern farm, not between two businessmen, not between two neighbors. It was recorded in the first chapters of Genesis. The two brothers were Cain and Abel. And that walk out into the field ended with the first murder recorded in the Bible. Strange, isn't it? The first death in the biblical narrative does not happen in a war. It does not happen over money or over a fight for territory. It happens inside the same family, and at least at first glance, for a reason that seems far too small. One brother could not stand seeing the other accepted, but maybe this was never really a story about offerings or agriculture or raising sheep. Maybe it was always a story about an emotion that still shows up today. Envy. Now that we know who these two brothers were, there is a question that completely changes the story. Did it all begin on the day the offering was rejected? Because that is how almost everyone remembers it. But when you look closely, it seems like the text is telling us something else. It is interesting. When Cain's offering was not accepted, no one praises Abel in front of him. No one humiliates Cain. No one makes a comparison. In fact, the opposite happens. Before anything worse takes place, God speaks to Cain. It is not a conversation of condemnation. It is almost a warning, like someone saying, "You can still choose what you are going to do with this." That changes the way we look at the story, because it shows that envy did not appear out of nowhere. It could still be controlled. This may be the strangest part. Think about it with me. Even if Abel disappeared, the problem would still exist. The rejected offering would still be rejected. Nothing would change. So why attack the one person who had done nothing against him? Maybe because envy works differently. It does not necessarily want to grow. Sometimes, it only wants the other person to stop being above it. It is a strange feeling, because instead of asking, "How can I do better?" he begins to think, "How do I make him stop existing in front of me?" And that still happens today. Not always violently, but in smaller ways. When someone celebrates another person's failure, when someone feels uncomfortable seeing someone else recognized, when someone would rather diminish the person doing well than try to grow too. Almost everyone remembers the murder, but the murder was the final step. The crime began earlier. It began inside Cain's mind. First came comparison, then resentment, then envy, then silence, and only after that came the field. That may be one of the most modern parts of this story, because nobody makes a decision like that out of nowhere. Great tragedies are usually built little by little. There is a line in this story that has survived for thousands of years. Sin is crouching at the door. it is a very interesting image. Like someone waiting outside. It has not come in yet, but it is waiting for an opportunity. And what comes next is even more interesting. But you must rule over it. In other words, the text does not treat Cain as someone without a choice. It treats him as someone who could still say no. That completely changes his responsibility. After the crime comes one of the most famous answers in the Bible. Am I my brother's keeper? It is a question that sounds designed to escape guilt, but it survived for another reason, because people are still asking it today, maybe with different words. That is not my problem. Everyone should take care of their own life. That has nothing to do with me. And maybe that is exactly why this line remains so well known, because it says less about Cain and more about all of us. One of the most interesting things about this story is how short it is. It is only a few verses, and still, it has generated centuries of discussion, because there is one question that appears almost every time someone reads Genesis 4. After all, why was Abel's offering accepted and Cain's was not? Curiously, the text never answers that directly, and that silence is exactly what opened the door to different interpretations. Across Jewish and Christian tradition, one of the best-known readings is that the difference was not only in what each brother brought, it was in the disposition of the heart of the one offering it. That interpretation became even stronger centuries later, when the letter to the Hebrews says that Abel offered his sacrifice by faith. Other scholars point to another detail. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock and the best portions of the animals. The text makes a point of mentioning that. But with Cain, it only says he brought fruit from the ground. For some interpreters, that difference in description may suggest a difference in devotion. But that is not the only reading. Some prefer to focus on another moment in the narrative, the conversation that happens before the murder, because instead of explaining why one offering was rejected, the text quickly changes the subject. It starts talking about Cain's reaction, as if it were saying the most important question was never, why did God accept one offering? But rather, what does someone do when they do not get the response they expected? Maybe that is why this story still draws so much interest. It does not give answers to every question. It forces the reader to live with some of them. And maybe the most uncomfortable one is this. Two people can go through the same situation and still react in completely different ways. There is something that stands out to me in this story. Almost nobody wakes up wanting to destroy another person, but a lot of people wake up comparing themselves to someone else. And maybe there's a huge difference between those two things. Because Cain did not begin that day thinking about killing his brother. What he could not handle was something else. The idea that Abel was living the life he wanted to live, and that is still incredibly relevant. Today, maybe it is not an offering. Maybe it is a promotion, a video that went viral, a business that worked out, a friend who bought a house first, a sibling who always gets praised, someone who seems to have found their place in the world before you did. And then something strange happens. When the achievement is ours, it feels fair. But when it happens to someone close to us, sometimes it feels like a provocation. Not because that person did anything wrong, but because their happiness touches a part of us that is still unsatisfied. Maybe that is why so many relationships start changing without one big fight. The person keeps smiling, keeps sending messages, keeps saying everything is fine, but inside, they have already started rooting a little less, celebrating a little less, feeling bothered a little more. And there is one curious detail. Cain never tried to do better next time. He never tried to understand what he could change. All of his attention went to Abel, as if eliminating his brother would solve a problem that, in reality, was still inside him. And maybe that is the most human point in the story. When we turn another person into the explanation for all our frustrations, they stop being a person. They become an obstacle. And when someone becomes an obstacle, we start justifying things that once would have seemed absurd. Maybe that is why the story is still being told. Not because most people would be capable of committing the same crime, but because almost everyone has felt, at some point, that secret discomfort of comparing themselves to someone else. The difference is what each person does with that feeling. The most uncomfortable part of this story is that Cain did not hate a stranger. He hated someone close to him, someone who grew up beside him, someone who, in a way, reminded him every day of what he could not accept in himself. Because comparison almost never begins by looking dangerous. It begins small, a discomfort, a question, a strange feeling when someone close to us is recognized. Today, it appears in much quieter ways, at work, in the family, on social media, in the friendship that starts to cool down when one person begins to grow, in the comment disguised as a joke, in the criticism that sounds like concern, but is not, in the difficulty of celebrating someone who got exactly what we wanted. And if a person is not careful, it grows. The other person's happiness begins to feel like a provocation. The other person's success begins to feel unfair. The other person's presence begins to feel like a problem. But that is the lie envy tells. It makes a person believe that if the other one stops shining, their own pain will disappear too. But it does not disappear, because the problem was never in Abel. It was in Cain. And maybe that is the question the story leaves us with in the end. When someone close to us is loved, recognized, or chosen, our first reaction reveals a lot. We can ask, why him? Or we can ask, what do I do now? And maybe that choice keeps saying far more about us than about anyone else. So, my friend, it is like I always say, history doesn't repeat, people do.